talk about the combination of electronics and acoustical instruments, but that's a very significant period in 20th century music that you are very much a part of. Could you talk about, well, you spent time at IRCAM in Paris. What was it like to be there on the cutting edge of electronics and exploiting that range of sounds? What was that like?
Well, it was a very special time of the history, and now it's very difficult to think that in the end of 70s, in the beginning of 80s, computers were huge. The computers that you could use for something a little bit more refined, for example in music making, they were enormous, several meters, and for example in Europe there was only one big PDP-11 that composers could use, and then it was used for time sharing. It was in time sharing system, so at IRCAM, when you wanted to work to have a little bit more computing power, you were working during the night because there were a little bit less people. So it was kind of strange atmosphere. People were working there day and night, and you had to be quite fanatic to try to make music with technology that time, because there was no real time, so everything was computed, and you spent a lot of time waiting for the results of the competition.
And that in turn, I imagine, that set of sound possibilities is not something that simply is isolated within electronics, but it's something that expands your own sense of what is possible in sound. And one thing that you are known for as a composer is a sense of color, and that's something that cannot be said equally of all composers in any century or any era. But you in particular have this very keen sense of sound, very precise and very nuanced sense of sound. Does some of that come from working with electronics? Is that something that opens up your ears a bit more?
Well, I think it's maybe on the contrary. I started to work with computers because I saw that there were new possibilities to analyze the sounds. And I was so interested in sounds that I wanted to understand them more physically and acoustically, their behavior in acoustics. And that was the reason I started to first to work with computers, to understand the sound. The programs that we were able to use, they were like microscope, and so I really could learn about the sound, and of course that did influence then my orchestral writing also, because I gained so much knowledge about it, how sound is behaving in space and time, and what makes certain sounds so particular.
I can see that. We will talk about other works, and especially about the work that's being premiered this evening. But I think the other thing that I just can't help but talk to you about is Finland. And obviously, we in Los Angeles were blessed for 17 years with Esa-Pekka Salonen as a music director. We heard his works. Magnus Lindberg, who was here, Anssi Kartunen, who was a soloist here, I know we've collaborated with. And the more you survey the world of classical music in recent decades, and I mean, we can actually go back into the 20th century, but especially the music scene in terms of performers and conductors, Finland, for a rather small country, has a very immense footprint around the world. And I know that people talk about being a very musical country, but part of it has to do with just a concept of the importance of musical education. And I wonder, for us in the States who have seen such things shoved to the side, could you talk a little about what musical life is from childhood in Finland? Because that seems to be an important thing here.
Well, I think one important thing is just the historical fact that when Finland started to fight for its independence, we happened to have Sibelius. And he became really like symbol of our independence and identity. And for some reason then that gave the general impression for people and important people that composer and music can be something important for the identity of the country. And then later decades, when the country was a little bit more wealthy, then when they started to building the education system, I think there happened to be some really clever people who then really made a music education system which could reach people all over the country and which was not expensive. And many of our singers, for example, come from little villages somewhere, most of the most famous Finnish singers. So I think the education is really important thing.
And I think you're right, that is absolutely important. Cultural identity, political, taking a look at Europe in the late 19th century into the 20th century, including, of course, Finland, you cannot name a country where political nationalism is separated from musical and artistic nationalism. They do go hand in hand, which led many people to try to read into Sibelius's works reflections of the Finnish landscape, the mountains and this. And I know that some critics in writing about your music as well have sort of implied that they connected to something that is innately Finnish. Is that something you believe is true, that there is a Finnish element that comes through in what you write?
Well, music is such an abstract art form that it's very, of course I can say that there might be something Finnish, but how do you define it then really? So one thing that I can imagine that has a deep impression on everybody who grows in Finland is it's the extreme slow changes of light during the year, and I think this we experience really strongly in our body and in our mind also.
Yeah, I can imagine that's the case. Well, let's talk some about the work tonight, True Fire. And you said that one of the great pleasures is to know exactly whom you're writing for, and that's a great privilege for composers who have been, recognized by the performing community who are in that position. And of course you have. About the choice of texts, it's an interesting combination of texts that you have. How do you go about choosing? Well, let's even go further back. The genesis of the composition. Does it start with the idea that you're going to write something for this particular singer and you're then going to find the text, or is it that you have an idea that springs from the material itself? Can you sort of fill us in a little on that?
I'm trying to remember, but it stems some years back, and I so much love Jerry's singing that we started speaking about it a while back, and then I felt that it's time to write a song cycle for male voice. I have never done it, in fact. And then that's why then choosing the texts, also I wanted to find something new for me. Often I feel that the texts I'm using in my music, they are like a little bit autobiographical, and so something that I have lived, and that makes me to choose certain text. And now when I was having this thing for a male singer, I wanted to imagine his mind more, and different situations in his life, and that became my starting point. And then in fact, it was very difficult to find text. I was looking for them. I started to have ideas for the music and how I would like to write for his voice, but I didn't have the texts. So finally I combined very different texts to have material for the musical ideas.
And what you say very much goes hand in hand with what you said a bit earlier, that your initial reservation about opera was that you didn't want to write an opera, the stereotypical superficial opera, that words have to have meaning. And then obviously in your case, the music has to amplify the meaning of the words, and that's very much what you've accomplished here, and I think it's a wonderful thing. I'd like to thank you for joining us, talking for up front. Kaija Saariaho, thank you so much. Thank you so much. And in terms of a combination of two composers,